Welcome to all of you. This is really wonderful to see so many people here and old friends of the Graphic Studio and the Contemporary Art Museum, new friends, so thank you. I'm Margaret Miller, in case you don't know me, and I have the privilege at the moment of serving as the director of both Graphic Studio and the Contemporary Art Museum. I co-curated this exhibition that you're about to see with Mark Fredericks, and Mark Fredericks is kind of hiding over there, but he is a research associate at Graphic Studio. Offset Rauschenberg at USF Graphic Studio tells the story of Robert Rauschenberg's long and productive collaboration with Donald J. Saffe. Don founded Graphic Studio in 1968, served as distinguished professor, chair of the art department, and in 1971, he was appointed founding dean of the College of the Arts. It was the College of Fine Arts then, and it's the College of the Arts now, and our new dean is about to change the name again. So together, Rauschenberg and Saffe worked on projects that had profound impacts locally, regionally, nationally, and globally. Rauschenberg's legacy is explored to a small degree in our exhibition through works by artists that recall Rauschenberg's radical approach to materials, process, and concepts. To illustrate this legacy, Mark and I selected works by artists that have either worked at Graphic Studio or participated in exhibitions at the Contemporary Art Museum, including the late Tricia Brown, Rochelle Feinstein, Christian Markley, Narciso Martinez, Bosco Sodi, and Tavares Strachan. Recently, Don Saffe gifted, what you see on the screen, a small box signed in 1953 by Rauschenberg. I hope I said this right. Scatoli. I knew I'd get that right. Scatoli Personali. And this was created when Rauschenberg was traveling with Cy Twombly in North Africa and Italy. And it really was the instigation of this exhibition. Mark and I said to ourselves, we need to make a show about our history, the history of Rauschenberg at Graphic Studio, the history of Don Saffe's collaboration with Rauschenberg. It needs to be told to a whole new generation of students, faculty, and community, and I might add, university administrators. I'd like to recognize and introduce a few people that are here tonight. The Dean of the College of the Arts, Chris Garvin. Chris, where are you? CAM's Curator at Large, Christian Vivros-Fonet. Maybe you can kind of wave as I do these. Graduate art history students helped us with the research for the catalog entries, Hannah Weber and Callan Donahoe. A former director of Graphic Studio, Alan Eaker, a sculptor and painter who worked with Rauschenberg to produce the clay pieces that are part of the exhibition. The director of research and the man who brought and revived photogravure to life at Graphic Studio, Deli Sacciolato. Assistant and coordinator of the Rocky Tour, Brenda Woodard. She loaned the Rocky posters to the exhibition. I am hoping that we can acquire them for our collection. Bennett Grutman is here, who advised Robert Rauschenberg on accounting, finances, philanthropic endeavors, estate planning, etc., and served as a trustee to the Rauschenberg estate. Other lenders to the exhibition include Jay Dellinger, who is here from the Bob Rauschenberg Gallery at Florida Southwestern State College in Fort Myers. Tavares Strachan, who is not here tonight, loaned 3 really wonderful works. Tom Pruitt, who is not only a lender to the exhibition and had previously collaborated on a number of projects with Don Saffe, he has loaned us wax fireworks that are in the exhibition. He's currently the studio manager at Graphic Studio. Sponsors to the exhibition, and without the sponsors, I'm in deep trouble. Penny and Jeffrey Vinnick, the Vinnick Family Foundation. Stanton Store is here somewhere. Embrace the Arts Foundation. Blake Casper and Allison Adams and their Casper Adams Foundation. I know that Allison is in Cairo and can't be here tonight, and Blake is in Aspen. Former president of the university, Judy Genshaft and Steve Greenbaum, Amy Ucci and John Veenstra, and Albert Alfonso. I know Albert's here with Alfonso Architects. Please know that the registrar, curators, financial manager, educators, preparators, designers make up an amazing team of Graphic Studio and the Contemporary Art Museum. This image is them, this group, some of this group, installing Chinese Summer Hall, produced in 1982 on a 100-foot single sheet of paper made by Kodak. And this demonstrates, I think, our culture of cooperation, inventiveness, and a really distinguished staff. I advise the dean and anyone who asks me, always hire people that are smarter than you are. This guarantees your success, and this is a group of amazingly smart people. So there's a picture of them installing Chinese Summer Hall, which you'll see in a moment. Tonight, Dr. John Blankenshire, endowed Associate Professor of Contemporary Art at the University of Arkansas, will talk with Dr. Donald Saff about ROCCI, the Rauschenberg Overseas Cultural Interchange. In addition to serving as the director of Graphic Studio, Don served as the artistic director of ROCCI. The exhibition evolved as it toured to 10 countries from 1984 to 1991, and concluded at the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. So first, before they get into a conversation, let me introduce you a little more to each of these distinguished men. Donald J. Saff is an artist, art historian, educator, lecturer, and author specializing in the fields of contemporary art, and most of you don't know this probably, and American and English horology. He told me recently that he might be better known for his work in the field of horology than art. At Graphic Studio, he pushed the boundaries of printmaking, both technically and conceptually. This is a work by Nancy Graves, and you can see moving from printmaking to making objects or reliefs coming off the wall. James Rosenquist, Mirage Morning, and Roy Lichtenstein, one of the chairs that Don collaborated with Roy to produce. On March 6, 1986, the U.S. Senate celebrated the establishment of a Graphic Studio archive at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. Here's the illustration of the congressional record. Ted Kennedy addressed President Ronald Reagan, and you can read the entire the entire record, but let me quote a little bit. Mr. President, Graphic Studio USF has produced a body of work exemplary of the imagination, innovation, and sensitivity to the human spirit that has given rise to American leadership in the international world of art. In 1989, the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. presented a major exhibition of Graphic Studio productions, accompanied by a detailed catalog written by Ruth Fine and Mary Lee Corbett. We continue to add to the archive at the National Gallery with our new publications. Now, Don's education, experience, and interest make him a remarkable innovator, entrepreneur, and creative collaborator. He is an artist, and this is one of his prints. It's you with the one with the bird on your shoulder. This is always fascinating me. He studied electrical engineering at Queens College, and then he changed his major to art history and printmaking. He has received an MA in art history from Columbia, an MFA from Pratt, and a Doctor of Education from Columbia University. He was awarded in 1964 a Fulbright to Italy, where he worked with printers, helping him understand what the collaborative process could really bring to the production of artwork. He has work in many, many collections, including the Smithsonian, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Museum of Modern Art, and the National Gallery. He came to USF in 1965, and as I mentioned before, by 1971 he was the dean. So that allowed him to support this graphic studio endeavor. I did say in my introduction in the catalog, which you can all get one, that he was a disruptor, bringing composers and artists that weren't always well received, but were certainly innovative. In 1978, he co-authored Printmaking, History and Process, and another book on screen printing with his lifelong friend, Deli Sacciolato, who's here tonight. He left USF in 1990 and continued in his collaborations with artists at Saftec Arts. He was a distinguished visiting artist at the Rhode Island School of Design, senior curator of prints and drawings at the Guggenheim, and he wrote and lectured on clocks. His book, From Celestial to Terrestrial Timekeeping, is illustrated on the screen. He is a recipient of the Guinness Book of World Records for building the most accurate pendulum clock. This is Don receiving the certificate in 2015. Don also had another talent, and that was that he participated in agility competitions with his poodles. And here he is with Annie. Dr. John Blanketer is an art historian. He studies the history, theory, and criticism of late modern and contemporary art with a special interest in the relationship between aesthetics and politics. I think that's going to come up tonight. His dissertation and a book that followed was on Georgy Kepes, Undreaming the Bauhaus, published in 2019 with the MIT Press. Here is the image, a cover of the book, and a couple of images of the photographs of Kepes. He explores in this book the entanglement of art and military power during the Cold War and the interdisciplinary collaborations of Kepes. He has written on Andy Warhol's Death in America paintings, and more recently on Ruth Asawa, who died in 2013, but has had a flurry of exhibitions recently, the one at the Whitney Museum just closing. He wrote about her because she began the beginning of her career in doing drawings in the internment camps. Before coming to the University of Arkansas, John taught at the University of Oxford. He was a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Southern California from 2016 to 2018. He was a postdoctoral fellow at the National Gallery from 2014 to 2016. He is currently working on another book called The Culture War Machine, a contest of images that explores the cultural wars in contemporary art. He researched Rocky at the Rauschenberg Foundation at the National Gallery, and he discussed in his lectures the role of art as geopolitics. I have to tell you, when we went up to Oxford, Maryland, and took John up there, Mark and I, and Don asked him about his background, and he went through it, and Don said, well, you're certainly an overachiever. So now I'm going to try to stimulate a conversation between the two of them, and I'll just be very quiet unless I feel like I need to interject something. And Mark Fredericks has put together a scroll of images from the Rocky exhibitions, and so it tells you what country the series is from. And those are just going to run behind us as we have a conversation. So my first question is to John. How did you become interested in researching and writing on the Rocky tour?
Okay. Well, before I answer your question, I just want to say thank you, Margaret, for this invitation to be part of this panel. I also want to thank Mark and the staff at Graphic Studio for arranging everything, and Don. It was great to visit in Oxford and then to be here on the stage, so thank you. My interest in Rocky. So I first encountered Rocky in a course when I was a graduate student at Stanford The course was on contemporary Chinese art. So we traced the history of contemporary art in China from the 1980s to the present. And one of the key things that kept coming up in the literature, in the art criticism, the scholarship, was this idea of before Rauschenberg and after Rauschenberg. Kind of a BC and AD way of thinking about Chinese art, that Rauschenberg's visit to China had this extraordinary impact. So that kind of set off my interest. I am not a specialist in Asian languages or culture, so hard for me to do research on Chinese artists, but this was a way for me to kind of get into the material and to think about the impact that Rauschenberg had in Chinese art. I mean, it just was so surprising to me that over and over, Rauschenberg's name appeared as the origin of contemporary art in China. It's actually this American artist. That was fascinating to me.
So Don, I have a question for you. Can you describe how the Rocky Tour came about? How did the project evolve?
Okay, firstly, thank you, Margie. And I did not want to participate in this, nor loan works to the exhibition. But I know Margaret very well. She was a student of mine many, many decades ago. And I knew that saying no is just useless. And so it didn't take long to capitulate, and I'm delighted, having seen the show and having read the catalog, or the workbook, as you call it. So I thank you, and I thank Mark, and I especially thank what was a very successful continuity of directors of Graphic Studio. Because to walk through Graphic Studio as I did today and see the quality of work and the innovation that's taking place, it could not be more, heartwarming. I was followed by Alan Eker, who did a superb job and kept the ball rolling through difficult financial times. Then Hank Hine, and for many years now, my former student and dear friend, Margaret. So it's been, 50 plus years or so. And who would have thought, that just being bored in the city of Tampa in 1965, that we'd have so much art to show for that boredom. Now, your question was about Rocky. Bob obviously had a global intent in his thinking. He certainly wanted to think himself as a citizen of the world, and I don't know whether serving at the end of World War II in the Navy and dealing with the psychological effects of the war on people shaped his thinking about his concern for people, humanity. But he traveled widely. He used material and artistic directions from a number of sources. He was global from the outset. Well, a gallerist by the name of Doug Christmas wanted to do a show, a world tour, and Bob kept thinking about it but declining. And in 1982, Bob was invited to go to the world's oldest paper mill called the Schwann Paper Mill, known for what they call 1,000-year paper that was not made with acid, and so it would last, it wouldn't degrade. And we went, my wife Ruth went with me, and we went supposedly to the world's oldest paper mill, except they wouldn't allow us into the world's paper mill because they had seen the book that Deli and I wrote and the section on paper making was in there, and they assumed that I was there to steal their ideas. And in spite of the fact that I suggested that the Japanese had already co-opted every idea they ever had in terms of paper making, it made no difference. As a matter of fact, they tried to dissuade Bob from going by telling him that they only had nude men in the paper vats moving the pulp around, which then really made Bob want to go. So there we were working on this project, and we never did get to the paper mill, but we made it work from the so-called VIP compound. And Bob, he's so kind to people and so open. The cooks that were there started to teach him how to make dumplings, chowsers. And he got into a conversation with one of the cooks and asked him where he lived and where his family was. He said his family is 25 miles away. And Bob said, how often do you see them? And he said, I can't see them. I'm not allowed to go. You know, if I could, the paperwork would be overwhelming. And then Bob returned to the dining room the next day, and we sat down, and with the cook sitting with us and not understanding a word of what we were talking about, Bob said to me, you know, if he doesn't know what's going on 25 miles away, how can he know what's going on 2,500 miles away, or let alone a continent away? He says, I think I know what to do with this world tour. I want to take works of art from one country that is inspired by that country and show it to another country. And I want to go to places that process would be useful, sensitive areas. Obviously not Paris or London, but Tibet, Malaysia, Cuba, and so forth. And so that was the essence of the idea. Now, how to make that work was another issue.
Don, maybe before we get much further, can you say something about the name Rocky? I mean, obviously it stands for Rauschenberg Overseas Culture Interchange, and I've always thought, you know, it brings to mind the UN. The whole project was announced to the world at a press conference at the United Nations, so things like the UN, you know, a kind of government agency acronym, but it also had another resonance. Can you say anything about that?
Well, Bob did a dance that was called Spring Training. Spring Training.
Yeah.
And in that dance was, he rented, I think, 25 turtles. And to their back, he strapped flashlights. And one of the concepts that one finds in Rauschenberg's choreography is that he will place objects, people, in positions that are not predictable, so that the dance has to remain totally innovative and different each time. And so while there might be an overall concept, the individual moment is never the same as a previous performance.
He couldn't control the turtles?
Huh? No, he couldn't control the turtles. But also, you know, being in China and realizing that one of the symbols for the universe in the East was, you know, a turtle with a stele on its back, or the universe on its back. And so this turtle was named, he kept one of the turtles, was named Rocky. The use of the flashlight on a turtle was brilliant, I thought, although it took me years to realize what he was doing, that he took something that moved, an animal that moved at the rate of a turtle, and put something on its back that moved at the speed of light. And that play is so indicative of what Bob's all about. And so the origin is the name of the turtle. And I don't know that it goes any deeper than that, unless you have an idea about that.
Well, I think it's a kind of clever Rauschenberg joke, a sort of comedic aspect to reference the turtle. and also kind of, use the acronym itself. Seems very common in a lot of his work, a kind of double meaning, a play with words, I
Right.
would say.
And he was a great wordsmith.
Yeah.
And, those things never happened by accident. And, even the titles, he would talk about the titles of work was always the final punctuation in a sentence. And so every title is carefully orchestrated to finalize the work that he was producing at the time.
Yeah. So in this project, your role was artistic director. What did that entail?
Oh. Well, it entailed how do you move hundreds of works of art, some of which weighed, 1,000 pounds, hundreds of pounds, around the world. Where do you place it? How do you produce a catalog? How do you get authors to write a catalog in various countries? And so my role was to be, I guess what you call a front man. I went ahead of Bob. I didn't travel with him very often. And I would go to many, many more countries than we actually had finally in the exhibition, in the tour. So I would go. I would meet with authors. I would look at different spaces. I would see whether they were interested or willing to have an exhibition. And I did this very often, fighting the State Department because of places I had to go to. Dealing with, I have to say, dealing with the CIA and the FBI. Dealing with people who thought it was inappropriate to visit certain countries. Going to Chile was very difficult on many levels. Part of it from some of the students that were there, in which it was a kind of Yankee go-home concept. We don't want any cultural imperialists coming here. To places like Cuba, that where they were very knowledgeable. They knew what was going on and wanted the show. And but even how do you get to Cuba? The only way I got to Cuba was through my brother Ed, who's a world-class mathematician, who carried a letter from me to the cultural minister, delivered that, and I got a response that they were interested, except I couldn't get a license to go there. So it meant, how do you get to Cuba? And Eastern Airlines had, as an aside, at midnight, one day a week, Eastern Airlines became ABC Airlines, would fly into Havana. The engine would keep running. You got off the plane, and they would take off again. And that was once a week you could get to Havana. And that was a way of getting there. Eventually, difficulties, for example, when the longshoremen found that we were shipping work to Havana, they refused to send it. And so I said, okay, well, we don't have to send it out of Miami. We'll send it out of Galveston or someplace like that. And nobody on the entire coast would take it because it was going to communist Cuba. And so the decision was to send it to Sweden, to send to Cuba. So here you have Rauschenberg in Florida sending artwork to Sweden to get to Cuba. We finally figured out a way of getting it to Mexico, taking it off the plane to Mexico, and then putting it on another plane and getting it to Cuba. But there were so many issues like that.
Yeah.
And so fascinating from the point of view of meeting authors and not going through the USIA. So it was critical that Rocky not be seen as a project, an American project or a government project, and eventually not even a project funded by anybody, collectors, private institutions, public institutions.
How was it funded?
It was funded by Rauschenberg himself by selling off most of his collection of people like Jasper Johns, Cy Twombly, really significant works. He would not take any money because any money would be possibly tainted. It didn't start that way. I mean, I did try and get money through Philip Morris, and then we realized, no, we don't want it. We don't want Philip Morris, And then, the builders of Sikorsky helicopters, no, we don't want that. Right. And then in the end, it was, I should pay for it myself, and he did. He carried all the finances on his own. And again, so there'd be no confusion, he refused to sell any work.
Yeah.
And, often he was, getting to Rocky, they thought often that this was a project that would make a lot of money. And I have to say that, Bob had a lot of ways of making money. One of the ways he could make more money than he was making was to make less art. And that never stopped him from making more art. He was not about making money, but he wouldn't sell any of the works. He donated a work of art to the people, not to a given museum or the government, to the people of a given country, and a work of art to the National Gallery. And the concept behind giving the work to the National Gallery, so that with each country that was visited, a work would go to the National, the ambassadors, if there were any, or the liaisons, if there wasn't an embassy, would meet, and he felt that in an informal way, maybe these people from disparate countries would get together and be more pleasantly inclined towards one another.
In getting to some of these countries, I mean, the thing that's always been fascinating to me is the concept of the sensitive country. So the countries that are, run, they have totalitarian dictatorships, or maybe they don't have relations with the West, they're closed off in different ways. And you've spoken a little bit about, just the kind of logistical challenges of getting to a place like Cuba. Was there a concern about safety? I mean, how were you perceived when you arrived as, just by the local population, by whoever, was there to greet you?
Did you say safety?
Safety,
Were you ever
or
in
even
danger?
just, were you in danger? I mean, some of these countries are officially, enemies of the U.S. in some way.
I was uncomfortable. Yeah, there was a number of places I was uncomfortable. Oftentimes I was more uncomfortable coming back here than I was being there. And I dare say nowadays it would even be worse. Yes, I mean, when I got to Peru, the Shining Path was very active. And I realized that sending Bob to Peru would create an opportunity for this Shining Path to take him as hostage. And so I became quite concerned about that. I had a very difficult time getting out of Peru because I was a target. And yes, I was concerned for safety there. I was concerned for safety going to Tibet at the time because the Chinese did not want me to go to Tibet and set up an exhibition. They were willing to have the show in Beijing, but not in Tibet. I did go to Tibet, and that was of some concern. Yes, and I was warned by the various authors. I was warned not to speak to certain authors. They preferred that I not speak with Borges, when I went to Argentina, though he was in Geneva. They certainly preferred that I not speak with Jose Donoso in Chile because he was so anti-Pinochet in government. So it was quite a tightrope in terms of safety and thinking ahead in terms of this entire crew coming to a country with Bob and his entourage. I always had an eye on that,
And it seems like there's an element of kind of diplomacy that has to happen behind the scenes to make it all happen. I mean, to get the access, to make sure that it would be safe, to figure out, who can assist the visit when it happens.
Well, yeah, I took assistance from anyone with the exception of the American embassies. And so I guess, in art, the end justifies the means. And I don't think you could say that in many other areas, but in art, the end justifies the means. And I did what I had to do to get an exhibition there, whether, basically whatever I had to do.
And what was it like meeting part of this was also involved corresponding with major world leaders, meeting with them. So in Cuba, for example, there's a meeting with Fidel Castro.
Yes.
Can you say anything about how, that experience of meeting these kind of infamous world leaders or corresponding with them?
Well, it gave me insight, and I think Bob at the same time, meeting with Castro, he was amazing, incredibly charismatic, tall guy, hand on your shoulder, talking about how you cook shark, and, how long it takes to cook shark, and how the Chinese, if you had a lot of nobility and with a lot of servants, because it takes a long time to cook it, you could cook shark, and they talked back and forth. It was Rauschenberg, myself, and Rauschenberg's sister that met with him. And though he could speak English, he had an interpreter who could interpret at the same rate he was speaking, which meant that he probably said the same thing all the time to visitors. But he hosted us, Bob he could not be one up. So eventually, talking about the shark, Castro said, if you'd like, I'll, cook you a meal. And Bob said, I'm the good cook, and Castro said, well, I'll cook you a meal. And Bob said, well, you could cook breakfast for me. And he said, I'll cook breakfast for you. And Bob said, great, because I never eat breakfast. Says it's the Castro. The conversation went on with talking about Kennedy and how he inherited the problem. And then he turned to me first and he said, why do you have a beard, I said, because my face is so fat and I need a beard, to make it elongated and look good. I said, why do you have a beard? He said, I don't want the beard. He says, but it represents the overthrow of the government and the revolution. And then he turned to me and said, do you realize that the United States is dropping an atomic bomb twice a week in South America? And then I said, I don't understand what you're saying. And he said that, if the United States would give them the humanitarian aid they need, that he would save the lives equivalent to drop, And then it was a 2-hour litany. What did I learn from that? He was, the monster he was. He could be charming. You could be seduced very easily by the style, the glib talk, but in the end, he was what he was, and we listened to it. Bob was Bob, had the last word, and the show was acceptable to them, and we went. So
Was it in multiple locations in Havana?
it was in 3 separate locations, right? And as a matter of fact, you could get gold less expensively than white paint in Cuba. And Bob flew paint over to paint the galleries because everything was painted in what they call universal beige, which I think is just dirty walls. And so Bob flew over 5-gallon drums of Sears and Roebuck white paint, and we got halfway through the Bellas Artes gallery, and then the paint was stolen. We never could finish it. But yes, there were exhibitions.
Maybe we can turn a little bit. We've had some works above us in the slideshow. One of my questions, and something that I think is kind of interesting and maybe even challenging about Rocky, is that there's kind of 2 things happening. There's the work that, in my view, is very essential, the work you're doing as artistic director to make all the travel happen, to get access, to get kind of buy-in from the host country. That, the project doesn't exist without that. At the same time, there's also the work that Rauschenberg is then producing often back here in Florida, in Captiva. So my question, how does the work relate to the visit? And how do you kind of piece together what you see in the art with the experience of visiting the country?
I think Bob's goal was to do something on behalf of peace, okay?
Yes.
And he thought, how do you develop peace? How do you convey the concept? And, Rauschenberg had the ego to think that he could create peace through the arts, but he didn't have the conceit to think that it would really happen, but perhaps there would be a step in the right direction. There was a big difference. He was always a collaborator, and I think he once said to me that you have two people, you have three ideas. You have her idea, you have his idea, and then you have the combined idea. So you have three. So he was a collaborator from the outset. Even his environment when he worked, there was always a group of people around, or often there were a group of people around. And they would come and go from the house to the studio. The dogs, 4 or 5 of them would come along. And he would work, and the TV would be on, and information would be flowing with conversations, and he could hear, you whispering in the corner. He heard that conversation. You had to be careful. And the TV was on. He followed the soap operas and everything else. But the essence was collaboration. And so how do you collaborate? And he thought he could go to these countries, find their imagery, get a sense of the culture, and with that, with taking their imagery, photography, speaking to people, speaking to the poets, speaking to the students, speaking to the artists and the art historians and anybody he could speak to, the guides, the drivers, whatever. He spoke with everybody. And with this and with the material, he went back and he produced works of art that were based on materials that would be present in a country, but seen through a totally different parallax. And by so doing, he thought, well, I'm in touch with what you're doing, but here is an alternative. And that was especially so when you come to sensitive countries where alternatives were not so acceptable. In China, it wasn't so acceptable. And there are people in the audience who could attest to that, who were there, who were precluded from going to Beijing to see the exhibition. There were, people in Chile who would not go to the Bellas Arts because it was a state museum. We decided to show in a state museum for good reason. And then if you take this imagery and you show it to people, they think, there's another way of doing this. There's another way of thinking. In the end, as he always has done, he gives you license. And he gave people license. And so you get art before Rauschenberg and art after Rauschenberg, because the license he gave the students and the thinkers allowed them to think differently and start producing differently and change the complexion. And with the gifting of the art and the conversations with ambassadors and politicians and poets and on, hopefully that dialogue would be meaningful in terms of peacemaking. Bob loved dialogue. He loathed monologue. And so he always cooperated.
And I think, that's something you can, to me at least, you can see in the works that he produces. It's not solely the Rocky works, it's kind of all of Rauschenberg's works. It's like what he was offering with the concept of the combine, with these kind of layers of assemblage, different objects, different images, kind of open-endedness, I would say. The work is not didactic. It doesn't tell you how to interpret it. It leaves it open. So maybe that, to me, when I'm standing in front of a work by Rauschenberg, it's that kind of open-ended aesthetics, sort of associative. It's open to the viewer, kind of bringing something to it. It seems, as you're saying, it's kind of built into the process here as well, the concept of why one would want to collaborate, want to visit these countries. It's to, another way of kind of bringing that open-endedness.
Right, but of course, a lot of people were very unhappy, very unhappy that we would go to, as I said, to Chile when Pinochet was there. And I remember, because some very good artist friends, were outraged that Bob would do that. And how do you have a dialogue if you don't go there? How do you deal with this if you don't speak to the people? And I spoke to someone, an older artist in Spain, who thought that it was a big mistake for artists to shun Spain during the reign of Franco, that it did more damage for the artists to stay away than it would have been for them to go.
Yep.
Clearly, this was an invective. His art, by its very nature and its freedom, is an invective against that kind of totalitarian thinking that Pinochet and Castro and others represented. And so the object was to go, irrespective of all the pressure to not go.
I know that sometimes you had already moved on to a next country when a show would open, but can you talk a little bit about what the response was at the time that the exhibitions appeared in Havana or in Chile and Santiago? What were the newspapers saying? What were artists saying?
Well, it was depends upon the country. Again, going back to Chile, it was pretty negative. We had a lot of negative press, and I think at one time I suggested, that I make an effort to get one of the other newspapers to try and cover it, because for a while he was getting positive press from a pro-Pinochet newspaper. So let's get some press from an alternate newspaper. So that was arranged, but that press was negative too. So apparently, critics abound. Right. They have their opinion irrespective of their political view. But it was initially not well received. This is a long-time project. The more I realize it, yes, we started, with the concept in '82. CCNY just gave a class on Rocky in their graduate program, a class on Rocky, because of what is continuing to happen. So some of the reaction took place much later. Curiously, I was contacted by the State Department because they had a link to Cuba, and they were requesting a continued conversation with me about Rocky and to tell me what the effects had been in Cuba with Rocky. And now the State Department was, positively supporting this because of, a certain degree of goodwill that was created. It just varied, and it was very negative and very positive, but for most young people, it was very liberating and very influential.
And even when in 1991, the National Gallery exhibition went up, you got Roberta Smith in the New York Times. There were two exhibitions, one at the Corcoran of the earlier work, and then the show at the National Gallery. 125 works were part of the Rocky show at the National Gallery. And she wrote, which is this mixed review, the Rocky exhibition as at once altruistic and self-aggrandizing, modest and overbearing. And what did Bob Rauschenberg think about a review like that? What did you think about the reception in the U.S.?
Well, I didn't have to say much to Bob. I think at the time, I looked at that and I said, Bob, do you know what Cecil B. DeMille said about critics? He said, no. And he said, one shouldn't even bother to ignore them. Now, I mean, no offense to anybody here. But the fact of the matter is that Bob did ignore critical writing, and he was quite egalitarian about that. He neither read the positive reviews nor the negative reviews. It just was not something that was in his wheelhouse of thinking.
But I think by your telling of the courses that are offered, the number of dissertations and master's degree subjects, I think Rocky has people have a very different view of Rocky than the kind of suspicion that existed as it was developed and evolved.
Well, you see, we knew at the time, I mean, it was clear, this was what Bob was all about. He went, was it 72 when they went to Rio for the climate issue? I think that's when it began. Bob did the first Earth Day poster and, would support that, unending support of that concept. So he was involved from the very beginning with trying to do altruistic and life-saving work. He worked in behalf of artists' rights. Yeah. He worked with the Senate on copyright reform. He tried to get additional funding for the National Endowment. I mean, on and on in terms of assistance. When he was in Tibet, his parting words was, "I won't forget you, and if I have my way, the world won't forget you." And he supported them and contributed to them and talked about it, for years afterwards, sent material back to them, equipment and so forth. He was quite altruistic and giving, and his motives were really, I have to say, quite pure.
Well, maybe, building on that, I have a bit of the statement, the Tobago statement, this is a statement that Rauschenberg authored in 1984, and it became kind of the mission statement, I would say, of the project as a whole over many years. And he writes, "The purpose is to promote peace through active communication with art. Emphasis will be placed on sharing experiences with societies less familiar with non-political ideas or communicating worldly through art. I feel strong in my beliefs based on my varied and widely traveled collaborations, that a one-to-one contact through art contains potent, peaceful powers." So that is the kind of mission statement that Rauschenberg, I think you're right, this is who he was, that kind of language. And it's not just in that statement, it's in all of the correspondence. Everything he writes about Rocky comes from that same place. One question I have is this word non-political, just to kind of push harder. Is it really non-political? And I think I have trouble reconciling the mission of peace, non-political communication with Fidel Castro, Erich Honecker, all of these, Gorbachev, for example, figures that are kind of intrinsic in just making the project happen.
I told you I didn't want him on the panel.
It's my job. That's why I've been
In fact, it was political. Of course it was.
Yes.
In some ways, the organization of the tour and meeting these politicians.
it had to be, and he was political. He was not naive. Bob wanted to wage peace and not wage war.
Yes.
And again, the end justifies the means. If we had to deal with politicians, which we had to,
Yeah.
it couldn't happen any other way. And he knew that, and you know, he's an agile guy who certainly gave me the room to negotiate with these people, Eric Honegger, which was difficult. You know, all he kept saying was little steps, and would not give in, and Bob would not give in. Honegger wouldn't allow us to have a show in East Germany and Berlin at the same time while the wall was up. Bob wanted to have a show in which it was linked through video, and it just wouldn't happen. It eventually happened without West Berlin because the cultural minister happened to be in New York at the time. Well, he called me, and we went on a tour of Manhattan, and we got on the Staten Island ferry, and someone had the radio on, and while we were in front of the Statue of Liberty on the Staten Island ferry, there was an announcement that the wall was coming down. And at that moment, I called Bob, and he said, we'll have the show in East Germany, and told Wolfgang Pollock, I think his name was, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
That we would do the show, and we would do it without Berlin. We didn't need Berlin, West Berlin anymore. And so we did the show. Eventually we did the show. But the politics were, you know, he wouldn't do Alexandria and Jerusalem because we needed to have our passports stamped. If we had a passport that was stamped for Israel, they wouldn't let us go into Egypt at that time. And we made a big thing out of it and made it quite clear that we were not going to do the show, which they both wanted. We wouldn't do the show. Well, that's politics. And Bob made a firm decision. As much as we thought it would be good to go, in that case, it was more important to take a stance than it was to have the show. And he stood by, that decision.
Now, how are we on time, Marty?
We got 2.5 minutes.
Do you want to open it up for a moment to the audience? If people want to ask a question, would you be open to that?
Sure.
Does anyone have a question?
Yes. Don, there was a fun story that you shared with a few of us. It was one image that's probably 10 or 15 feet from the left-hand side of the 100-foot scroll. And it was an image of Stalin, Mao, Lenin, and a fourth dictator.
Trotsky.
But you shared a fun story with us. I thought the others would enjoy hearing that.
This is an image in the 100-foot that's also produced as a single image.
Okay. So the paper mill in Jingshan that I mentioned earlier, so we got the graphic studio purchased the big Hasselblad camera with a long lens that basically I had to schlep because, Bob walked and I carrying this camera. And on rare occasions, I'd be carrying the camera and Bob would say, take that picture. And we were on a sort of somewhat deserted street, and there was this picture of the dictators, and it was fading, and it was just at the time that the Gang of Four, they were putting them in jail, and China was trying to take away images of Mao. So we saw this, Bob looked at that from across the street and said, take that picture. And so I took the picture, and out comes, I guess he was police or Gestapo, or what, he looked sinister with a uniform. And he came running over to me, and Bob sort of backed away. and he said, he starts saying, through the interpreter, give me the film. You have to give me the film. And, well, the Hasselblad's so I'm holding the camera, and this guy is like yelling at me, and I said, I don't understand. I'll give you the film just in a minute. So I went over here and I pulled the roll of film out of my pocket. as this thing and hand it to him. And I took the film, thought he had the real thing, and we had the picture.
But you said it was.
We went back the next day, and the image was gone. That picture is in the 100 footer. Have a look at it. Yeah.
Another question?
Don, I'm sure you worked with both Bob Rauschenberg and Jim Rosenquist.
Yes.
What was their relationship with each other? Because obviously they were both, they were good friends, I know, but I'm sure you had the insight on that.
I had to write an obituary for Jim Rosenquist, who's, like Bob, dear friend and wonderful. He was wonderful. He was wonderful to my mother, actually. Every Christmas he gave her gifts. He never gave me gifts. Well, actually he did, but but it disturbed my father quite a bit after years of receiving jewelry from Jim Rosenquist. I remember Bob describing, I talked about Jim to Bob once, and he said the first time he saw him was by Coenties Slip, where Jim had a studio. And Jim had this, golden hair, and the sun was coming up behind Jim, and Bob saw this vision, and Bob thought he was an angel, it's just a vision of an angel. And I must say, I wrote in this obituary for the American Art Museum or whatever in Washington, that perhaps he was. Jim was wonderful, and Bob loved him. And I have to say that I never heard Bob say too much about other artists, hardly anything positive and certainly nothing negative. The only positive people he talked about was Matisse and Jim Rosenquist. Yeah. And that was it. So, and Jim loved Bob as well. And so it was an extraordinary relationship.
I'd like to say one thing.
Okay.
So, Bob and Rocky, I was there with Don and stuff.
That's one take.
Bob truly thought it's not about the fame or the glory that really matters, but it's learning about caring and sharing. And he wanted to teach the world about itself. And so all his photos of all the people, he wanted to share their life with everyone.
That's from Lawrence Wojtek, who is a longtime Rauschenberg collaborator, came up with so many innovative techniques and processes along with Bob, and produced so many of Bob's most significant works. Lawrence Wojtek, thank you for being here.
So when you go over to the museum tonight,
There were more
you can
questions.
take a workbook or a catalog that documents the show to some degree.
Martin.
But it's our ambition to do a book, a substantial book, and get John and I hope, Lawrence, I know you've published before, and at the Rauschenberg Foundation, you talk about what the working atmosphere was in Captiva, and I hope that can become a broader part of the story. I've asked Jade Dellinger, who's here, to work and write about that.
There's some more questions.
There are, I can't.
Good to see you. Kirk.
Oh, Kirk. Okay.
I was almost 40 years ago at the National Gallery in Beijing, saw Bob's show. And that really just opened our eyes for what art could be made. And that influenced the whole generation. However, my question is, that was right after Cultural Revolution. How did you break the ice to get these bureaucrats to allow you to even having a show at the National Gallery, which is at the time always showing like social realism? That's basically what it is. So how did you do that? I'm just very curious.
Very easy. It was very easy. A woman by the name of Junwei Su Chin was at the Maryland Institute. Her husband taught subparticle physics at Johns Hopkins. and also did teaching at Nanjing University. And they needed him for his teaching of physics. So I went through Jun Wei to her husband, who wired the introduction with the cultural minister, who was obligated to at least listen, and in fact was sold on the idea. And at the same time, I convinced him to invite Trisha Brown to do a dance performance there, which was, I thought, even a greater accomplishment. I didn't think they would ever go for that. That was fun. And we had it outdoors, and there was no light. So Bob got all these taxis together, put the headlights on the dancers outside, and the performance took place in spite of the lack of electricity. Yeah.
Well, should we go over and see the exhibition?
Wait, one last thing. I want to say about John, I want to thank you. When I listened to John's lecture at the Courtauld Institute, I was incredibly impressed with his scholarship, his efforts, his ideas, though, they were, slightly different than my view of things, but that his diligence and research was superb, and his insights, enlightened me in many ways. And, I just want to thank you for that, and I'm glad we could be here to share the
Yeah,
stage
it's been
together.
great. It's been great. Thank you.
Thank you for you.